Mama, Mr. Edmund told me a secret. I'm really good at keeping secrets, right? Emery Shaw looked down at her 7-year-old daughter and felt something cold move through her chest. Because the old man next door had been dead for 3 days, and Maeve was still talking about him like he'd just stepped out for groceries. Edmund Aldrich had lived alone at the end of Oak Street in Dorchester, Boston. Quiet old man, flannel shirt, tomatoes on the porch, a rocking chair that creaked with every push. Nobody in the neighborhood knew his name. No friends from his past called, and no family ever came. He was a ghost to the world, cared for only by Emery and her curious daughter. She'd wandered over one afternoon, curly brown hair everywhere, mouth going a mile a minute, looked straight at him and said, "Are you lonely? You're always sitting by yourself." And just like that, the man who once made the entire eastern seaboard tremble couldn't find a single word to say back to a little girl. But he smiled. For the first time in years, he smiled. What nobody knew, not Maeve, not her mother, not a single soul on that street, was that the old man in the rocking chair had built a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions. His name once carried more weight than any judge or badge in the state. But he'd walked away from all of it 8 years ago, handed everything to his son, and disappeared into this tiny house to die alone. Except he didn't die alone. Because Emery Shaw, 27, single mother, 2 jobs, 4 hours of sleep a night, surviving on tips and stubbornness, started checking on him, bringing him food, making sure his heater worked. Not because she knew who he was, because that's who she was. And in the final weeks of his life, Edmund leaned close to Maeve, hands trembling, breath thin, and whispered 6 numbers into her ear, just 6. He told her to remember them, told her never to tell anyone, told her someday the right person would come, and she'd know. Maeve nodded, with the kind of seriousness only a 7-year-old can carry. "I promise, Mr. Edmund." 3 days later, he died in that rocking chair, with her drawing still taped to the wall. A son, a house, and a little girl holding an old man's hand. Emery paid for his funeral flowers, with a week's worth of tips, $47. No family came, no one. But here's what Emery didn't know. Those 6 numbers her daughter was carrying around like a schoolyard rhyme could unlock every buried secret Edmund Aldrich had spent 30 years collecting. Corrupted officials, offshore accounts, evidence that could bring down 3 of the most powerful criminal organizations on the East Coast. Whoever held that code held a loaded gun pointed at the entire underworld. And now the only person alive who knew it was a 7-year-old girl who drew butterflies and talked to stray cats. 2 days after the funeral, a black car pulled up outside Edmund's house. A man stepped out, 36, dark suit, cold eyes, the kind of presence that made the air heavier just by existing. Corvin Aldrich, Edmund's son, the most dangerous man in Boston. He walked up the porch steps and stopped, because there, tucked in an old milk bottle by the door, was a paper flower made by a child's hands. The note read, "I miss you, Mr. Edmund. Love, Maeve, age 7. He held it for a long time, and somewhere deep inside him, something cracked. He didn't know it yet, but that little girl was about to become the most hunted child on the eastern seaboard, and he was about to become the only thing standing between her and every wolf closing in. Join me as we dive into this story. If you believe the most dangerous people can show the most unexpected kindness, hit subscribe. Like this video and share it with someone who needs it today. Now, let's go back to Corvin Aldrich, and the moment he realized that protecting one little girl might cost him everything he'd built. Corvin stood in his father's living room and didn't recognize a single thing. 8 years earlier, Edmund Aldrich had lived in a mansion on Beacon Hill, drunk 30-year-old scotch, and worn tailored suits from Milan. Now, Corvin was looking at a room with a peeling ceiling, old wooden floors that creaked under every step, and a smell in the air that was old books mixed with damp earth. A bookshelf stretched across nearly the entire wall, filled with paperback novels, cracked spines, yellowed pages, the kind of books sold in thrift shops for $1 apiece. On the kitchen windowsill, 3 tomato plants had withered dry, the soil split and parched, with no one to water them, since the day Edmund could no longer get up. The rocking chair was still in the corner of the porch, worn down along both armrests, its upholstery frayed so badly that the stuffing showed through. Corvin touched the side of the chair, and it rocked once, groaned, then stopped. The house was silent, as though it was holding its breath. But what made Corvin stand still the longest wasn't the decay, it was the drawings. They were everywhere, taped to the refrigerator, pinned to the kitchen wall, tucked into the bathroom mirror, stacked on the dining table. Dozens of them, all drawn in crayon, all made by the same small hand. A bright yellow sun in every picture, a house with large windows, a cat with whiskers far too long, a curly-haired little girl holding an old man's hand, and in the lower corner of every drawing, the same crooked line of writing, the same name. Maeve! Corvin picked one up. The paper had curled at the edges, the crayon had faded, but someone had carefully taped it back together when it came loose. His father, the man who had once ordered an entire smuggling network erased in a single night, had sat here, in this kitchen, taping a 7-year-old child's crayon drawing back into place. Corvin's phone vibrated. Orla Keenan. He answered, but he didn't speak first. "You're at his house," Orla said. Not as a question. Her voice was low, tired, but steady. She had worked for the Aldrich family for 30 years and never wasted a single word. "How did he live?" Corvin asked. His voice was flat, but the question wasn't. "Quietly," Orla said. "The first years he didn't speak to anyone. No phone calls, no letters, no contact. I sent someone to check on him every month. They reported that he was still alive, still well, still alone. Then, about 2 years ago, my people said there was a child who often came over to play. Every day, after school. He began to change." "Change how?" "He started growing tomatoes," Orla said. "It sounds small, but you understand what I mean." Corvin understood. Edmund Aldrich had stopped waiting to die and started growing something. Because of a child. "Orla," Corvin said, "did my father ever say anything about the code in his final months?" "Never. You knew him. That code went with him to the grave." Corvin looked down at the kitchen table. Beneath the stack of drawings, he saw a small slip of paper, handwritten, Edmund's handwriting, shaky but still readable. 5 words. "The code has been delivered. Safe." Corvin set the slip of paper down, looked again at the drawings. At the name in the corner of every one, Maeve. His father hadn't taken the code to the grave. His father had given it to a 7-year-old child who drew suns with crayons. Memory dragged Corvin back 8 years, to the conference room on the top floor of the building on Federal Street. Edmund sat at the head of the table, his hair already white, his eyes still sharp as knives. Corvin was 28, sitting on his left. Tynan was 23, sitting on his right. "I'm leaving," Edmund said. "No discussion. From tonight on, everything belongs to Corvin." Tynan had opened his mouth to object, but Edmund raised his hand, and the whole room fell silent. "I built this for 30 years, and I created something to protect it." He called it life insurance. A digital account, encrypted, containing everything Edmund had gathered over 3 decades. Names of officials who took bribes, police officers on hidden payrolls, judges who bent verdicts, offshore transactions, accounts in the Cayman Islands and Zurich, shipping routes. Enough evidence to bring down not only the Aldrich family, but everyone who had ever done business with them. The account was locked with 6 digits. Whoever had the code held a shield or a sword, depending on how they used it. "What's the code?" Corvin had asked. Edmund looked at his son, then looked at Tynan, then shook his head. "No one gets to know. When you need it, you'll find it." That was the last thing Edmund ever said about the code, and that was the last time Corvin saw his father. Until today, when he stood in this peeling kitchen, holding a slip of paper with 5 words on it, surrounded by the crayon drawings of a child his father had trusted more than his own 2 sons. Corvin folded the slip of paper and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, on the same side as the small paper flower with Maeve's crooked handwriting on it. He stepped out of the house, closed the door gently, and stood on the porch for a long while, looking down the quiet street. Somewhere on this street, a 7-year-old girl was carrying in her mind the thing the entire East Coast underworld would be willing to burn everything down to take, and she didn't know. Corvin Aldrich's penthouse sat on the highest floor of a glass building in Back Bay, looking down over the entire Boston skyline. There were no family photographs on the walls, no plants, no color. Everything was glass, steel, gray marble, and deliberate silence. This penthouse wasn't a place to live, it was a place to control. From here, Corvin ran an empire that, from the outside, looked like the empire of any successful businessman in Boston. 3 fine dining restaurants in the seaport, 2 nightclubs in the theater district, a real estate company that owned more than 200 rental apartments across the city, and an import-export company operating out of Boston Harbor. On paper, all of it was legal. Taxes paid on time, top lawyers, accountants who didn't miss a penny. But beneath that code of legality, money from the smuggling network flowed through the restaurants and became clean revenue. The nightclubs were where deals happened in VIP rooms that no camera could record. The real estate was a way to launder money no bank dared ask about. And the import-export company controlled everything moving in and out of the harbor, from legitimate cargo to the containers customs never opened. Corvin hadn't built this empire. His father had. But Corvin had turned it into something even Edmund could never have imagined. A machine that ran without noise, without traces, without error. That morning, Corvin sat at the head of the conference table in his private office. 4 men sat across from him. No one spoke. No one looked him directly in the eye. Corvin was only studying a sheet of paper, a financial report from one of the restaurants in the seaport. The numbers didn't match. Not by much. Only about 40,000 over 3 months. Small enough for someone to think no one would notice. Big enough to die for. Corvin set the paper down and looked at the man sitting third from the left. He didn't say his name, didn't accuse him, just looked. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Sweat began to bead on the man's forehead. His hands clenched beneath the table. The 2 men beside him shifted their chairs away, as though physical distance could save them. Corvin still didn't speak. He only folded the paper slowly, precisely, then pushed it toward Pierce Gallagher, who was standing by the door. Pierce picked up the paper, nodded once, then looked at the 3rd man. That was all. Not a single word was said. The man stood, his legs trembling, and Pierce opened the door for him to leave. The meeting was over. The other 3 men left in silence, each step faster than the one before it. Corvin remained seated alone. That was how he ruled. No need for shouting, no need for threats. Corvin Aldrich's silence was more terrifying than any bullet, because when he was silent, no one knew what was coming. They only knew it would come. 10 minutes later, Tynan walked in. No knock. It was always that way. Corvin's younger brother was 31 years old, dressed in a gray suit, his hair slicked back, an easy smile on his mouth, though his eyes never smiled with it. Tynan sat down in the chair across from him as though it belonged to him, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at his brother with the kind of ease only someone with the same blood would dare have in this room. "Have you heard about father?" Tynan said, not as concern, but as the opening to what he truly wanted to say. "Varga knows. The old man is dead, and Varga will assume everything is unsettled. He'll turn over every stone looking for that code." Corvin didn't react. "Have you found it yet?" Tynan continued, his voice light, but his eyes sharp. "Father's code." "No," Corvin said. "One word. Flat," offering no invitation for the next question. Tynan sat still for a while, his finger tapping lightly on the arm of the chair. Then he stood. "If you need help, I'm here. Always." Tynan walked out. Corvin watched him until the door had fully closed. He knew his brother, knew that smile, knew exactly how much that always was worth, the precise distance between loyalty and greed, and that distance was growing shorter by the day. Corvin picked up his phone. Pierce answered before the first ring had finished. "I need you to look into 2 people," Corvin said. "A woman named Emery Shaw and her daughter, Maeve. They live on Oak Street in Dorchester. Find everything. Where she works, what school the child attends, which bus route she takes, where she buys groceries. Everything." Pierce was silent long enough for Corvin to know he was memorizing, not questioning. Then Pierce asked only one question. "Level of approach?" "No approach," Corvin said. "Observation only. No one touches them, not one hair. And they don't get to know we exist." Pierce hung up. Corvin turned his chair toward the glass wall. Boston stretched beneath him, glittering, orderly, as though everything had its place. But somewhere in that city, Philip Varga was calculating. Tynan was calculating. And a 7-year-old girl in Dorchester was asleep in a small apartment above a laundromat, unaware that she had just become the most valuable piece on a chessboard she didn't even know she was sitting in the middle of. While Corvin Aldrich sat on the highest floor of Back Bay, looking down at the city like a chessboard, Emery Shaw was standing at the warehouse entrance of a fulfillment center off Route 1, swiping her employee badge at 9:50 at night and beginning an 8-hour shift. The warehouse was as large as 2 football fields, with ceilings 12 meters high and bright white fluorescent lights that made no distinction between day and night. Emery stood at the sorting line, scanning codes by hand, placing packages into bins, pushing the bins onto the conveyor belt, repeating, repeating. 8 straight hours without sitting, except for 2 15-minute breaks. Her back had hurt since her 3rd month working here, and the pain never really went away. Her hands were cracked because the cardboard cut into her skin every night. Tiny splits, not deep enough to bleed, but sharp enough to sting every time she washed her hands. She wore gloves, but they were thin, torn after a few nights, and she didn't buy new ones because $4 a pair was $4 she didn't have. At 6 o'clock in the morning, she swiped out. The bus ride back to Dorchester took 40 minutes. She got home close to 7. Maeve had been at her grandmother Bridget's since the night before. Every evening before work, Emery took Maeve to Bridget's small apartment in Quincy, 2 bus stops away. Bridget fed her dinner, helped with homework, told her bedtime stories, and took Maeve to school early in the morning. Emery came home, took a hot shower for exactly 6 minutes before the water heater ran out, then slept. 4 hours. She set the alarm for 11 o'clock, woke up, got dressed, and walked to Callahan's for her serving shift from 11:30 to 3 in the afternoon. It was a small place, with burgers and sandwiches on the menu, and the customers were mostly office workers grabbing a quick lunch. Emery remembered the regulars' names, knew who drank black coffee and who added milk, knew which table liked quiet and which one usually ordered extra. She worked fast, never complained, always smiled, even though the dark circles beneath her eyes from lack of sleep told a very different story. On a good day, tips came to $35. On a bad day, 12. Today was a bad day. At 3 in the afternoon, Emery picked Maeve up from school. Mother and daughter walked home together. Maeve told her about school, told her the teacher had praised her drawing, told her the boy who sat beside her had fallen on the playground. Emery listened, nodded, asked the right questions in the right places, laughed at the right moments. She was good at this, good at hiding exhaustion behind a smile for her daughter. When they reached the apartment, she found a notice tucked under the door. A notice from the landlord. Rent would increase by $200 starting next month. $200. Emery read the paper twice, then folded it, slipped it into her back pocket, turned to Maeve, and said in a normal voice, "Come inside, baby. Mama will make noodles." She made instant noodles for Maeve, added an egg, sliced in a few pieces of cheap sausage to make it look like a proper meal. Maeve ate every bite. Emery ate what was left in the pot, standing in the kitchen, not sitting down because she was afraid that if she sat, she wouldn't be able to get back up. That evening, she took Maeve to Bridget's. Then she caught the bus to her night shift. On the bus, she took out the tips from Callahan's and counted them, $12. She arranged each bill in order, folded them, and put them back into her wallet. Then she did the math in her head. Rent, electricity, gas, monthly bus fare, food for the 2 of them, basic health insurance for Maeve. Then she subtracted the income from both jobs. Every month, she was short about $300. With the rent going up, she would be short $500. She didn't have $500. She didn't have $100 set aside. She had $12 in tips and 4 hours of sleep a day and cracked hands and a 7-year-old daughter who needed her not to fall apart. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Emery got home after being released early halfway through her night shift because the warehouse had run out of items to sort. The apartment was dark and quiet. Maeve was at Bridget's. Emery didn't turn on the light. She went straight to the kitchen corner, glanced into the inner room to confirm Maeve's bed was empty as it was every night, then leaned her back against the refrigerator and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. The refrigerator hummed behind her. The leaking faucet dripped steadily into the sink. Streetlight from outside the window threw a pale orange streak across the ceiling. Emery sat there. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried for herself in a very long time. She only cried for Maeve because she was afraid she couldn't provide for her, because she was afraid Maeve would go without something Emery wasn't strong enough to give. But tonight, she didn't cry. She only sat in the darkness, eyes open, staring into nothing, and breathed. Outside the apartment, across the street, in a dark-colored sedan parked beneath the shadow of a maple tree, a man sat silently. He had followed Emery from the warehouse, boarded the same bus route, walked half a block behind her, and waited until no light turned on in the apartment, though she had made it safely inside. He lifted his phone, called a single number, and said 2 words, "She's safe." Then he hung up. Pierce Gallagher received the call, recorded it, and forwarded a short message to Corvin Aldrich at 2:15 in the morning. Corvin read the message in the dark penthouse, set the phone down, and couldn't fall asleep again. 3 days after receiving Pierce's report, Corvin decided to return to Oak Street to observe the mother and child himself, not because he didn't trust his own men, but because dry lines in a report, street names, hours, routines, couldn't answer the only question he truly wanted to know: why his father had trusted this woman. He left his suit in the closet. He wore a dark jacket, jeans, sneakers, the kind of clothing Corvin Aldrich hadn't worn once in the past 8 years. No watch, no ring, nothing that would make anyone look twice. He drove the older model car Pierce kept for moments when anonymity was necessary, parked 3 blocks from Oak Street, then walked. Dorchester in November looked like a photograph drained of color. Bare maple trees, sidewalks wet with old rain, houses packed close together with rotting wooden porches and cracked cement steps. Corvin found a place to watch, the steps in front of a store that had been closed for a long time, its faded for lease sign hanging crookedly on a glass door, covered with newspaper. He sat down and waited. It began to rain at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Not a downpour, but the kind of November rain Boston knew too well. Cold, fine, stubborn. The kind that soaked into the bones before a person even realized he was wet. Corvin hadn't brought an umbrella. He hadn't thought he would sit here this long. But he stayed, because from this spot, he could see the road Emery would take from the bus stop back to the apartment, and he needed to see her with his own eyes, not through a report, not through a photograph, not through numbers on paper. At 6:15, Emery appeared at the end of the street, holding Maeve's hand. She had just picked her daughter up from Bridget's and was walking home to save the cost of 1 bus ride. Emery wore a thin gray coat, her wet hair clinging to her forehead. Maeve wore an old pink puffer jacket, a knit hat pulled low, and held a small umbrella over both of them. The umbrella was old, the fabric slightly torn at one rib, the plastic handle scratched, and 4 butterfly stickers were stuck to its surface. The kind of stickers children were given at school when they did well. Maeve tilted the umbrella more toward her mother, her own right shoulder soaked through. But she didn't care. Mother and daughter passed the place where Corvin sat. Emery didn't look over, her eyes fixed ahead, focused on getting her child home before the rain grew heavier. But Maeve looked. The little girl turned her head, saw the man sitting on the steps in the rain, his coat darkened with water, his hands resting on his knees. Alone. Maeve stopped. Her hand tugged gently at Emery's. "Mama, he's all wet." Emery stopped walking and looked in the direction her daughter was pointing. She saw a strange man sitting in the rain in front of an abandoned store. Her first instinct was to pull Maeve along. This neighborhood wasn't the kind of place where you stopped to talk to strangers, especially when it was dark and raining. But Maeve had already let go of her mother's hand and run to stand in front of Corvin. She stood there, holding the umbrella toward him, rainwater running down the small arm that gripped it. "You take this umbrella, mister. The rain is cold. Mama and I are almost home." Corvin looked up. The little girl stood before him, brown curls spilling out from beneath her knit hat, her large eyes watching him without fear, without hesitation, simply seeing someone wet and wanting to help. Exactly the way his father had described her through the drawings taped all over his house. Little son, Emery had stepped up behind her daughter. She looked at Corvin, her gaze quick, assessing, cautious in the way of a single mother who lived in a neighborhood that wasn't easy. But she didn't pull Maeve back. She looked at her daughter, offering their only umbrella to a stranger, and she knew that if she snatched it away, she would teach Maeve that kindness was something to be guarded against. She didn't want to teach her child that. "Take it," Emery said, her voice brief but not cold. "We're close by." Maeve placed the umbrella in Corvin's hand, grinned wide, then ran back to take her mother's hand. Mother and daughter walked into the rain without an umbrella. Emery pulling Maeve's hood up and bending her body to shield the child with her shoulder. She didn't look back. Corvin sat there, holding the child's umbrella. It was light, so light, it almost had no weight at all. 4 butterfly stickers shimmered under the streetlight through the rainwater. He opened it over himself and discovered that one rib was broken, the fabric torn at the right corner, rain still slipping through. The umbrella was nearly useless, and the little girl had just given him the best thing she had. Corvin folded the umbrella, stood, and walked back to where he had parked the car in the rain. He didn't open it again. He held it in his hand the whole way back, as if he were afraid that if he carried it carelessly, it would break. That night, in the Back Bay penthouse, Corvin set the umbrella on his desk. The dark oak desk where there was usually only an encrypted phone, financial files, and sometimes a handgun in the drawer. The butterfly sticker umbrella lay there, its plastic handle scratched, its fabric torn, one sticker peeling at the corner, in the middle of a world made of steel and shadow. It didn't belong here, but Corvin didn't put it away. 4 days after that rainy evening, Corvin walked into Callahan's at 12 o'clock noon. This time, he wasn't disguised, but he wasn't wearing a suit either. A dark jacket, dark pants, no watch, nothing remarkable. He chose the corner table by the window, set a small paper bag on the table, and sat there reading the menu like any other customer. Emery came to his table 30 seconds later, notepad in hand, a pen tucked behind her ear. "Hello, what can I get you?" Her voice was quick, professional, her eyes not yet looking closely at the customer's face because Table 7 had just asked for more water, and Table 3 was waiting for the check. Corvin pushed the paper bag toward her. "I'm returning this to you." Emery looked down at the paper bag, opened it, and saw the butterfly sticker umbrella. She went still. Then she looked up at Corvin, and this time she looked carefully. Her eyes widened a little. "You're the man who got soaked that day, on the steps in front of the store." Corvin gave a slight nod. Emery looked at the umbrella, then at him, and for the first time since the two of them had met, she almost smiled. Not the polite smile she gave customers every day, but something truer, shorter, as if it had escaped before she could hold it back. "My little girl will be so happy. She's been asking me about that umbrella for days. You didn't have to bring it back. It's yours," Corvin said. "You need it more than I do." Emery tucked the umbrella into her apron pocket, the trace of that smile still not fully gone from her mouth. "So, what would you like to order?" Corvin ordered the chicken sandwich. He wasn't hungry, but he needed a reason to sit here, and the reason he gave Emery when she brought out the food was the one he had prepared. "I was an old friend of Edmund's, Mr. Edmund on Oak Street. I only just heard he passed." Emery set the plate down and looked at him for a beat longer. Edmund never mentioned having friends. "In all the years I spent looking in on him and bringing him meals, I never saw another soul walk up those porch steps." "We knew each other a long time ago," Corvin said. "Before he moved to Dorchester, we lost touch for years." Emery didn't ask more. She nodded, the kind of nod that belonged to someone who didn't entirely believe him, but also had no reason to doubt him, then turned away to serve another table. But 10 minutes later, the restaurant door opened, and Bridget came in with Maeve. Today, Bridget had brought her granddaughter to eat lunch at the restaurant where her mother worked. Maeve ran straight behind the counter to hug Emery, then sat down at the small table near the kitchen corner, pulled out her stack of paper and crayons, and began to draw. But the little girl couldn't sit still for long. She looked around the restaurant, saw Corvin at the corner table, and her eyes lit up. "Mama, it's the butterfly umbrella man." Maeve ran to Corvin's table before Emery could react. The little girl stood in front of him, both hands braced on the edge of the table, looking at him with wide, unblinking eyes. "Did you get sick? You sat in the rain for a really long time that day." Corvin looked at the child. "No, I didn't get sick." "Good. Mama says if you sit in the rain too long, you'll catch a cold. Do you know how to draw?" No one had ever asked Corvin that question before. He handled traders with a silence that made entire rooms tremble. He could read 5-figure financial reports in his head without a calculator. But a 7-year-old child asked him whether he knew how to draw, and he had absolutely no idea how to answer. "Not very well," he said. Maeve took that as an invitation. She ran back to the kitchen corner, grabbed her paper and crayons, ran back, spread them across Corvin's table, and began explaining each drawing. "This is Pickles, The stray cat behind our building. One of his ears is torn. I feed him canned fish every morning. This is Mama. This is Grandma Bridget. This is Mr. Edmund. The little girl stopped at the last drawing, her finger touching lightly over the image of the old man in the rocking chair. I miss him. Corvin looked at the drawing of his father through the child's crayon strokes. An old man with white hair, a wide smile, sitting beside a tomato plant. More beautiful than any photograph he had ever seen of Edmund. Emery stood at the counter looking over, one hand holding a tray, not interfering, but not taking her eyes away either. Bridget sat at a nearby table, watching in silence. 10 minutes later, Maeve declared Corvin her new friend and promised she would draw him a picture next time. Corvin didn't know what to say, except, "I'd like that." He left the restaurant afterward, leaving $40 beneath the plate. This time, Emery didn't run after him to return it, but she stood watching through the glass until he disappeared at the end of the street. 4 days later, Emery noticed the first strange thing. The rent increase notice disappeared. Not disappeared literally, but the landlord called and said there had been a mistake. The rent would stay the same. Sorry for the inconvenience. Emery didn't believe in mistakes. Her landlord had never apologized for anything. The next day, a plumber came to fix the leaking kitchen faucet for free, saying the building owner had hired him. That faucet had been leaking for 7 months, and the landlord had never lifted a finger. 2 more days after that, the manager at Callahan's called Emery in and told her she was getting a $3 an hour raise, with no explanation. Emery stood outside the restaurant after her shift, the late November sun low and cold, and thought, she wasn't stupid. She had survived 27 years in Boston by knowing when something was too good to be true. And all of these things had happened at the same time, right after a strange man who claimed to be Edmund's old friend walked into the restaurant where she worked. The next time Corvin came to Callahan's, Emery didn't smile. She set a glass of water on his table and stood there, arms folded across her chest, looking straight into his eyes. "What do you want from me?" It wasn't a question. Her voice was flat, hard, and tired. The kind of tired that belonged to someone who had grown far too used to everything having a price. Corvin looked at her. Nothing. Emery didn't move. "My rent suddenly isn't going up anymore. My plumbing gets fixed for free. My wages go up without anyone explaining why. Then you show up. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. But I do know that nobody gives anybody anything for nothing. So I'm asking again, what do you want from me?" Corvin was silent for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, he realized that any answer he gave her would either be a lie or not enough. He couldn't tell her the truth, and she wouldn't accept a lie. "I don't want anything from you," he said. Emery looked at him for 3 more seconds, then picked up the glass of water, turned away, and served the next table. She didn't throw him out. She didn't tell him not to come back. But she didn't believe him either. And Corvin, for the first time in a very long time, didn't know what the next move was. Philip Varga was never in a hurry. That was what made him more dangerous than any man holding a gun. 48 years old, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair, a square face, and small eyes set deep in their sockets like 2 black stones. He ran the Varga organization out of South Boston, a network that controlled gambling, loan sharking, and transport along the coast, from Providence to Portland. He hadn't built his empire through brutality displayed in the open. He had built it with patience. He could watch a target for 6 months before making a move. He could sit across from an enemy at dinner, smiling and talking, then send men to that enemy's house at 3 o'clock in the morning. He wasn't impulsive. He didn't make mistakes because of emotion. And he had known Edmund Aldrich was dead before the body was even cold. News traveled fast in the underworld, especially when the dead man had once been one of the most feared names on the East Coast. Varga knew about Edmund's life insurance. He didn't know the details, but he knew it existed. Every powerful man on the East Coast knew Edmund had kept something that could burn them all to the ground. And now, Edmund was dead. That thing had to be somewhere. Varga sent 2 men to Dorchester. Not the kind who kicked down doors and asked directly, the patient kind. 2 middle-aged men in ordinary clothes, walking around Oak Street, drinking coffee at the shop at the end of the block, talking to neighbors as though they were looking to buy a house in the neighborhood. That old man at the end of the street? He lived alone, didn't he? Did anyone ever come visit him? People in Dorchester liked talking to strangers. It was a small neighborhood. People knew one another's faces, and a friendly question over a fence often received a longer answer than necessary. In 2 days, Varga's men gathered enough. The old man had lived alone, no friends, no family visiting. But there was a young woman and her little girl who often came over. A curly-haired child, about 7 years old, who sat on his porch drawing pictures every afternoon. The mother and daughter lived in the apartment above the laundromat, a few houses away. That information was on Varga's desk within 48 hours. He didn't act yet. He was arranging the pieces. At the same time, in a bar on Congress Street, 6 miles from Dorchester, Tynan Aldrich sat in a dark corner across from a man he had never met face-to-face before. The man didn't introduce himself. There was no need. They both knew who had sent whom. Tynan turned the whiskey glass in his hand, looked at Varga's intermediary, and weighed it one last time before opening his mouth. He had been weighing it for 3 days. Ever since Corvin said he hadn't found the code, Tynan knew his brother was lying. Not because Corvin was bad at lying, but because Tynan knew his brother too well. Corvin never said not yet, unless he had already found something and was hiding it. And the trips to Dorchester, the older model car Pierce kept for moments when anonymity was necessary, the hours when Corvin disappeared off the radar, all of it pointed in one direction. My brother is protecting a mother and daughter in Dorchester, Tynan said, his voice low and even. A woman and her 7-year-old daughter. My father lived beside them in his final years. The child is connected to the code. The intermediary didn't react, didn't nod, didn't shake his head, just listened. In return, Tynan continued, when the code is opened, I want a share, not an equal share, but enough for me to build something of my own, separate from Corvin. Silence. Then the intermediary stood, buttoned his jacket, and said only one sentence before leaving. Mr. Varga will be in touch. Tynan remained seated alone. He finished his whiskey. His hand didn't shake. He didn't feel guilty. He felt practical. That was the word he used in his head. Practical. Corvin was letting emotion control him, exactly like their father. And look how their father had ended. Tynan wouldn't make that mistake. 2 days later, Pierce called Corvin at 7 o'clock in the morning. There's a problem in Dorchester, Pierce said, his voice as flat as ever. But the fact that he was calling at 7 in the morning said enough about how serious it was. My men spotted 2 strangers asking around Oak Street 3 days ago, asking about Edmund, asking who visited him. The neighbors talked. Corvin stood beside the glass wall of the penthouse, looking down over Boston, silent for 5 seconds. Vargas, Pierce said. I confirmed it. His men. 3 more seconds of silence. Then Corvin spoke, his voice unchanged, but each word heavier than the last. The race has begun. Double the men in Dorchester, 24 hours a day. Eyes never leave the girls' school. And Pierce, find out for me who in the organization is talking to outsiders. Pierce didn't ask again. He understood. When Corvin said outsiders in that voice, he wasn't talking about Varga. He was talking about someone much closer. Emery's phone rang at 2:15 in the afternoon, while she was clearing table 4 at Callahan's. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer because the restaurant was busy, and the manager didn't like employees taking calls during a shift. But she saw the Boston area code and picked up. Miss Shaw, this is Miss Harrison, Maeve's 2nd grade teacher. I'm calling because there's something I think you need to know. The teacher's voice was calm, but there was something pressed beneath it. The deliberate calm of someone trying not to frighten a parent. Today, a man came to the school gate asking about Maeve. Emery stopped clearing the table. Asking what? He asked what class she was in, who picks her up every day, where her family lives. He said he was a family relative, but when I asked for his name and requested proof, he left. I reported it to the principal. The school will keep a record of the incident, but I wanted to call you directly because it didn't feel right. Emery thanked Miss Harrison, hung up, and stood still for 10 seconds in the middle of the restaurant. Those 10 seconds felt as long as 10 minutes. Then she took off her apron, told the manager she had to leave immediately, didn't explain, didn't ask permission, only said, I have to go, and walked out the door. She walked quickly to Maeve's school, 12 minutes away, her steps almost running but not quite, because she was afraid that if she started running, she wouldn't be able to stop. The school gate was quiet. Recess was over. Emery went into the office, signed Maeve out early, and waited. Maeve came running from the hallway, her backpack bouncing on her back, her face bright. "Mama, today I drew a cat that looked just like Pickles. Miss Harrison said it was really good. She gave me a star sticker." Emery bent down and hugged her daughter, tighter than usual, longer than usual. Maeve squirmed. "Mama, you're hugging too tight." Emery let go, fixed her daughter's knit hat, and took Maeve's hand as they walked home. She smiled at her daughter, nodded when Maeve talked about the cat in her drawing, about the orange color she had made by layering red crayon over yellow, about the friend beside her whose pencil broke. Emery listened to all of it, answered in the right places. But her eyes kept moving. Over her shoulder, across the street, to every car parked along the curb, every person walking in the same direction, every shadow at the end of the block. She had never done that before. She had lived in Dorchester for 27 years, walked home every day, and had never been afraid of the street she lived on. But today, she was afraid. Not afraid of what she could see, afraid of what she couldn't see. Someone had gone to her daughter's school, asked her daughter's name, asked who picked her daughter up, asked where her daughter lived, and she didn't know why. When they reached the apartment, Emery locked the door, slid the safety latch into place. Then she stood there looking at the door and realized the safety latch was only a thin piece of metal screwed into a rotting wooden frame. One kick, and it would break loose. She looked around the apartment with new eyes, the eyes of someone searching for safety and not finding it. Thin walls, she could hear the neighbor's television every night. Windows without bars. The building's security system was a front door lock whose code everyone knew. A fire escape outside the bedroom window, where anyone could climb up. She had lived here for 3 years and had never thought about these things. Now she couldn't think about anything else. Maeve sat at the kitchen table, continuing her drawing of the cat, completely unaware of anything that was happening. The little girl began to sing softly, a song she had learned at school, singing while she colored, her feet swinging beneath the chair because they still didn't reach the floor. Emery stood with her back against the locked door, watching her daughter, and for the first time, she clearly understood something she had never had to face before. She couldn't protect Maeve, not because she didn't want to, not because she wasn't trying, but because she couldn't. She had no money, no security system, no one to call. The police would ask if the man had made a threat, if he had done anything, and the answer would be no. He had only asked questions, and they would make a note of it and do nothing. She had a thin door, a cheap latch, and 2 cracked hands. That was all she had to stand between her daughter and whatever was coming. In her coat pocket, her phone lay still. In her contacts was a number a strange man had given her at Callahan's, telling her to call if she ever needed anything. She didn't trust that man. She still didn't trust him. But tonight, standing against that thin door while listening to her daughter sing, Emery realized that not trusting someone and not needing them were 2 different things. Emery called at 9 o'clock at night, after taking Maeve to Bridget's house. She sat on the bed in the dark apartment, staring at the phone number on the screen for 30 seconds before pressing call. The phone rang once. Corvin answered. She didn't say hello. "Someone came to my daughter's school today, asked about my child, asked who picks her up, asked where she lives." Silence on the other end. Not the silence of someone surprised, the silence of someone calculating. "I'll come," Corvin said. 20 minutes. Emery wanted to say there was no need, wanted to say she could handle it herself, but she looked at the thin door with its cheap lock and said nothing. She only hung up and waited. Corvin arrived in 18 minutes. Emery stood at the window and watched the black car stop in front of the building. It wasn't the old car he had driven that day in the rain. This one was glossy black, with dark windows, the kind of car she only saw in movies or parked outside hotels she would never walk into. A man opened the car door for Corvin. A driver. Corvin stepped out, and what Emery noticed wasn't his clothes or the car. It was the way everything around him changed. A man walking on the opposite sidewalk glanced over, then walked faster, his eyes lowered. 2 young men smoking at the corner fell silent, put out their cigarettes, and went inside. No one said anything. No one was threatened, but everyone automatically made room for Corvin Aldrich's presence, as though instinct told them this wasn't a man to stand too close to. Emery opened the door before he could knock. The two of them stood in the narrow hallway, the fluorescent light flickering overhead. Corvin looked around the apartment quickly, professionally, the way a man assessed threats, not furniture. Emery didn't invite him to sit. She stood in the middle of the room, arms folded across her chest, and asked directly, "You know who came to my daughter's school?" "It wasn't a question. I don't know exactly yet," Corvin said. "But I know why." "Then say it." Corvin looked at her. He had known this moment would come from the day he found his father's handwritten note in the kitchen on Oak Street. He just hadn't known it would be this hard to say. "Edmund Aldrich was my father." Emery didn't move. Her eyes didn't blink. But Corvin saw her shoulders stiffen, as if her body was preparing for a blow her mind hadn't yet processed. "Mr. Edmund, the old man who grew tomatoes. The old man who sat in his rocking chair so my daughter could draw pictures for him. That was your father." Corvin nodded. "My father left everything behind 8 years ago. He lived in hiding. He didn't contact anyone, including me. But before he died, he left behind something many people want. And he gave it to the person he trusted most." Emery took one step back. "No," Corvin said nothing. "Maeve, my daughter. She's 7 years old. You're telling me my child is involved in this. You're telling me people came to my child's school because of this." Corvin nodded a second time, slowly, heavily. And what Emery felt then wasn't fear anymore. It was anger. Pure, boiling anger. The kind of anger that belonged to a mother who had just realized that every bit of kindness she had received from the man standing in front of her, the returned umbrella, the rent that didn't go up, the fixed plumbing, the raise at work, none of it had been because the old neighbor was an old friend. It was because her daughter was carrying something his world wanted. "Stay away from us." Her voice was low, trembling, but every word was sharp as a blade. "My daughter is 7 years old. She draws butterflies. She talks to stray cats. She doesn't know anything about your world. Stay away from us." She walked to the door and opened it, a clear gesture. "Get out of my home!" Corvin didn't move. He didn't defend himself, didn't explain further, didn't say that he had sent men to protect her for weeks, didn't say that without Pierce's men, the night she walked home at 2 o'clock in the morning through an empty neighborhood, she might not have made it home safely. He only said one sentence: "If I stay away, no one stands between your daughter and the people looking for her." Emery stood there, her hand gripping the door tightly, her eyes fixed on Corvin. She wanted to scream in his face, wanted to throw him out and lock the door and pretend none of this had happened. But she couldn't pretend, because she had seen the way people stepped aside when he got out of the car. She had heard her daughter's teacher call with fear pressed beneath her voice. She had seen this apartment with its thin door and cheap lock, and she knew, though she hated having to admit it, that he was right. Corvin stepped toward the door. He stopped in the hallway, without turning back. "When you're ready, call me. I'll be here." The door closed. Emery stood alone in the dark apartment. She locked the door, slid the latch into place, then sat down on the floor right beside it, her back against the wood, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to be truly afraid. Not afraid of the rent going up, not afraid of losing her job, afraid that she wasn't enough to protect the only thing she had in the world. She sat there all night, didn't sleep, didn't cry, just thought. When morning came, she still hadn't called Corvin back, but she didn't delete his number either. 2 days after that night, Emery came to Callahan's for the lunch shift as usual. She still hadn't called Corvin back. She was still telling herself that she could handle it alone, that what happened at the school might have been only a coincidence, that if she lived quietly enough, whatever was coming would pass by without stopping. She told herself those things for 2 straight days. And then the envelope arrived. The manager at Callahan's handed it to her at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, saying someone had left it at the counter for her that morning. A white envelope, no sender's name, no recipient's name, only one handwritten word on the front: Emery. She opened the envelope in the back kitchen, beside the stack of clean plates and the hiss of oil frying on the stove. Inside was a photograph, just one, Maeve, in the schoolyard. The picture had been taken from far away, through the iron fence, at a slight angle, the kind of photograph taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. Maeve was running across the yard, her curls flying, her mouth wide with laughter, her old pink puffer jacket bright against the gray day. The little girl didn't know she was being photographed. There was no note with it. No threat, no demand, only the picture. And that was the most frightening thing of all, because a threat could be empty words. But the picture said someone had stood there, had watched her daughter, had been close enough to see Maeve's smile through a lens, and had chosen to let Emery know it. Emery set the photograph down on the kitchen table, picked it up, set it down again. Her hand shook so badly she couldn't hold it. The photograph slipped from her fingers twice. She stood in the corner of Callahan's back kitchen, among the smell of fried onions and the clatter of plates, and she felt the floor beneath her disappear. Everything she had told herself for the past 2 days collapsed in the 3 seconds it took to look at that photograph. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't going to pass by. Someone was coming, and they knew where Maeve was. She took out her phone and called Corvin. He answered before the first ring had finished. "Protect my daughter." Her voice didn't tremble anymore. It was flat, hard, the voice of someone who had passed beyond fear and reached decision. "But don't think I trust you." "I understand," Corvin said. "I'll come get you and Maeve in 1 hour. Pack for both of you, enough for a few days. Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." Emery wanted to ask more. Where? For how long? How this would work? But she looked at the photograph of her daughter on the kitchen table and didn't ask anything else. She left her shift, picked Maeve up from school early for the second time that week, went home, and packed clothes for both of them into the only travel bag she owned, along with Maeve's crayons and drawing pad, the stuffed bear Maeve hugged every night when she slept, cold medicine and toothbrushes. She called Bridget and said she and Maeve were going away for a few days, without explaining the details, only saying not to worry. Bridget was quiet for a while, then said, "Be careful, sweetheart," her voice heavy in the way of someone who knew something was wrong, but trusted her daughter enough not to ask. Corvin's car arrived exactly 1 hour later. Not the glossy black car, a gray SUV, discreet, with Pierce driving. Corvin sat in the back seat. Emery lifted Maeve into the car, and Maeve hugged her stuffed bear, looking around with curious eyes. "Where are we going, Mama?" "Away for a few days, baby." "Really? Like a vacation?" Emery nodded, smiled at her daughter, and felt that smile grow heavier than any smile she had ever worn in her life. The car drove 45 minutes north, past Salem, past Swampscott, to Marblehead, a small seaside town, quiet in that New England way, with houses roofed in gray wooden shingles, silvered by the sea wind, narrow streets, and the smell of salt in the air. The car stopped in front of a small 2-story house at the end of a sloping road, its front facing the ocean. Not a mansion, not a resort. A simple, tidy house, with a white fence and a wooden porch looking out over the rocks and the Atlantic horizon. Maeve opened the car door and stood still, staring at the sea. Her eyes widened, her mouth fell open. She had never seen the ocean this close before. "Mama, there's the ocean. Mama, there's really the ocean." Emery stepped out of the car and looked at her daughter standing on the sidewalk, gazing at the Atlantic, as if she had just discovered that the world held something beautiful she had never known about. And Emery had to bite her lip hard so she wouldn't cry in front of her child. Pierce opened the house door, checked inside, nodded to Corvin, then returned to the car to wait. Corvin stood outside on the porch while Emery led Maeve into the house. Inside, it was warm, clean, simple. 2 bedrooms, a small, fully stocked kitchen, a living room with glass doors facing the sea. The refrigerator had already been filled with food. The beds had been made. Towels were folded neatly in the cabinet. Someone had prepared everything before they arrived. Maeve ran from room to room, then out onto the porch to look at the ocean, then back inside to tell her mother she had seen a seagull and she wanted to go down to the beach right now. "Could she, Mama? Could she please?" Emery said yes in a little while. Then she stepped out onto the porch, where Corvin was still standing, one hand resting on the railing, looking out at the sea, but not crossing the threshold into the house. "You're not coming in? I need to handle a few things." Emery looked at him. In the November afternoon light, Corvin's face looked more tired than she had ever seen it. Not tired from lack of sleep, a different kind of tired, the kind that belonged to someone carrying something he couldn't put down and couldn't share with anyone else. "What kind of things?" Corvin looked at her. He didn't answer. Emery understood that a few things in his world didn't mean the same thing it meant in hers. And she didn't ask more, but she asked another question. one she hadn't meant to ask, one that slipped out before she could stop it. "You'll come back, won't you?" Corvin went still. He had heard many questions in his life. Questions from rivals, from lawyers, from subordinates, from enemies. None of them were like this one, because this was the first time anyone had asked whether he would come back and truly cared about the answer. Not because they feared him, not because they needed him, but because they wanted him to return. "I'll come back," he said. Then he stepped down from the porch, got into the car, and Pierce drove away. Emery stood on the porch, watching the car disappear at the end of the sloping road. Behind her, Maeve called out, "Mama!" The seagull came back. "It's sitting on the fence." Emery turned back inside, and for the first time in weeks, the door she closed behind her wasn't a thin door with a cheap lock. Marblehead was quiet in a way Emery had never known any place could be quiet. No bus brakes screeching, no neighbor's television bleeding through the walls, no water pipes rattling at midnight. Only waves, wind, and the cries of seagulls on the roof every morning. Maeve seemed as if she had been born to be here. On the first day, she stood on the porch looking at the ocean for 20 minutes without saying a word. The strangest thing Emery had ever seen from the daughter who never stopped talking. Then, starting on the second day, Maeve turned the beach into an outdoor art class. She sat on the rocks with her drawing pad on her lap, sketching waves, seagulls, the shells she had collected, the little house with the white fence that she called my beach house. Emery sat on the porch watching her daughter, drinking coffee from a clean mug in the fully stocked kitchen cabinet, and felt something strange that took her a while to recognize. Not worry. Not that the worry was gone completely, because her daughter was still being hunted by men whose faces she didn't know. But for the first time in months, she didn't have to calculate how many days $12 in tips would last. Corvin came on the fourth day. His car stopped at the end of the sloping road, and he walked up, still in dark clothes, still with that steady, silent stride. But today, there was no Pierce, no driver. He came alone. Maeve saw him first. She was drawing on the porch, looked up, and her whole face lit. Butterfly Umbrella Man. She still called him by that name. Corvin didn't correct her. He stepped onto the porch, and Maeve had already pulled him down to sit beside her before he could say anything. "Sit here, draw with me." Corvin looked at the paper and the box of crayons as if they were a timed bomb. He sat down on the wooden porch floor, folding his legs awkwardly because the place was too low for a man his size. And Maeve set a blank sheet of paper in front of him with 3 crayons. "Draw a cat, draw pickles." Corvin picked up the orange crayon. He hadn't drawn anything by hand since he was in school, and even then, he hadn't been good at it. He drew, slowly, stiffly, with lines like a man drafting a contract rather than making a picture. When he finished, Maeve tilted her head and studied it. Silence for 2 seconds. Then she burst out laughing. Not a little laugh. A laugh that made her lean back. A laugh so hard she had to hold her stomach. A laugh that brought tears to her eyes. "Mister, is that a cat or a cockroach? It has 6 legs. Cats only have 4 legs." Corvin looked at his drawing. It did look more like a cockroach than a cat. He didn't know how to react. He wasn't used to being laughed at. No one laughed in front of Corvin Aldrich. But Maeve's laughter wasn't the laughter of someone mocking him. It was the purest laughter he had ever heard, the kind only children could give, holding nothing back, calculating nothing, laughing because something was funny, and that was the only reason needed. "Let me teach you," Maeve said, still laughing. "Cats have 4 legs, pointy ears, a long tail. You have to draw the whiskers with a black crayon so it looks right." In the kitchen, Emery stood beside the sink, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, watching the porch through the glass door. She saw Corvin Aldrich, the man the whole neighborhood stepped aside, for when he got out of a car, sitting cross-legged on the wooden porch floor, while a 7-year-old child taught him how to draw a cat. He still drew badly. Maeve still laughed, and Emery felt something warm spread through her chest, something she didn't dare name, because naming it would make it real, and she wasn't ready for anything real with this man. She turned back to the sink and washed the already clean mug one more time. 1 hour later, Corvin stood. He needed to go. There were things waiting for him in Boston, things that had no crayons and no laughter. Maeve ran into the house and came back out with a drawing. "Wait, I drew this for you." She held up the picture. Three figures drawn in crayon. A tall man dressed in black stood on the left. A small girl with brown curls stood in the middle. A woman with long hair stood on the right. And above them, a bright yellow sun, almost half the size of the paper, shone its rays down over all three. "This is you," Maeve said, pointing to the man. "This is me. This is Mama." Corvin looked at the drawing. He said nothing. "You stand in dark places a lot," Maeve said, her voice serious in the way only she could be serious. "Mr. Edmund stood in dark places a lot too. But you should stand where there's sunlight. It's happier in the sunlight." Corvin bent down and accepted the drawing from Maeve's hands. His hand, the hand that had signed orders no one dared question, held that thin, weightless piece of paper as if it were the most fragile thing he had ever touched. "Thank you," he said. His voice was normal. But Emery, standing in the doorway, saw his fingers tremble slightly as he folded the drawing carefully, slowly, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, on the left, close to his heart, the same place where he had kept the small paper flower and his father's handwritten note. Corvin nodded to Emery without saying another word, then walked down the sloping road toward the car. Maeve waved until the car disappeared. Emery stood on the porch watching after him, and she realized that the warmth in her chest, the one she didn't dare name, was still there, still not gone, and she wasn't sure anymore that she wanted it to go away. Corvin drove back to Boston with Maeve's drawing in his jacket pocket and something far heavier than that drawing in his mind. Pierce had called him that morning, before he went to Marblehead, and said the 4 words Corvin had been afraid to hear for weeks. Tynan met Varga's man. Pierce didn't give more details over the phone. There was no need. Corvin understood. He had given him time, had waited, had hoped he was wrong. But he wasn't wrong. And now he had to do the one thing no one in his life had ever prepared him to do. At 9 o'clock that night, Corvin sat in the private office above the Seaport restaurant. The room was soundproof, with 1 table, 2 chairs, and no windows. The ceiling light glowed faintly yellow. There was nothing on the table except a glass of water and a phone lying face down. The door opened. Tynan stepped in. His younger brother wore a black leather jacket, his hair slicked back as always, his stride confident. He sat down in the chair across from Corvin, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at him with that familiar, faint smile. "You wanted to see me so urgently. What's going on?" Corvin didn't answer right away. He looked at his brother, looked closely, tried to find, somewhere in that face, whatever remained of the 23-year-old boy who had sat on their father's right 8 years ago, the boy who had opened his mouth to object when Edmund announced he was leaving, not out of hunger for power, but out of fear. Fear of losing his father. Corvin couldn't find that boy anymore. "You met Varga's man," Corvin said. His voice was flat, low, with no emotion on the surface. "A bar on Congress Street, last Tuesday." The smile on Tynan's mouth didn't vanish at once. It died slowly, like a fading light, going out from the corners inward. He didn't deny it. Didn't ask, "What are you talking about?" Didn't pretend to be surprised. He only sat still for 3 seconds, then said, "Who told you?" Corvin didn't answer that. "You sold information about a 7-year-old child to Philip Varga." Tynan drew a breath. Not the breath of a man who felt regret, the breath of a man shifting into defense. "You don't understand the situation," Tynan said, his voice regaining its calm, even carrying a trace of condescension. "Varga would find the child with or without me. He'd already sent men to Dorchester. He already knew about the woman. It was only a matter of time. I gave him something he was going to find anyway, in exchange for our position." "Not our position," Corvin said. "Your position." Tynan was silent for 1 second. Then he leaned forward, both hands on the table, and spoke in a lower, more direct voice, stripping away every outer layer of politeness. "You're letting emotion control you, exactly like Father. Do you know how Father ended? Dead alone in a miserable house in Dorchester. No one beside him, no one knowing his name. 8 years ago, he was the most powerful man on the East Coast. Then he gave it all up for something called conscience and died in a rotting rocking chair. Is that what you want?" Silence, long, heavy. The ceiling light hummed softly. No one touched the glass of water on the table. Then Corvin spoke, and every word was slow, clear, as if it was being weighed before being set down. "Father died in peace. Tynan gave a faint, bitter laugh. Peace. In a house that didn't even have proper heat. Father died with children's drawings taped to the wall, Corvin said, his voice unchanged, the smell of tomatoes on his hands. An open book on his chest, and a 7-year-old girl leaving a paper flower at his door because she missed him. Father died as a human being, Tynan. Not a beast, not a machine. A human being. He stopped, looked at his brother. And you're dying while you're still breathing. Tynan sat still. For the first time in the conversation, the smile disappeared completely. There was nothing left on his face, except the emptiness of a man who had just realized that the argument he had used to justify himself for weeks meant nothing in this room, in front of this person. You sold information about a child, Corvin said. A child who draws butterflies and talks to stray cats. The child father trusted more than his own 2 sons. You sold her to the enemy for money. Corvin stood, slowly. There was nothing threatening in his movement, but that was precisely what made it more terrifying. Because when Corvin Aldrich didn't need to threaten, it meant the decision had already been made, and nothing could change it anymore. From this moment, you lose the Aldrich name. You lose every access point to the organization, the accounts, the assets, everything Father built and I run. You no longer exist in this world. Tynan looked at his brother. His face had gone pale, but his voice still tried to hold steady. You can't do that. I'm your brother. You are my brother, Corvin said. And that's the only reason you're still breathing. You keep your life. That is the greatest mercy I can give you. Corvin walked to the door and opened it. Pierce stood in the hallway, his face expressionless, waiting. Tynan remained seated for 5 more seconds. 10 seconds. Then he stood, walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped, turned halfway back, and said something Corvin would remember for a very long time. You'll regret this. Corvin looked at his brother one last time. Maybe, but not today. Pierce led Tynan away. The sound of footsteps faded down the hallway. The office door closed. Corvin stood alone in the soundproof room, beneath the yellow light, with the untouched glass of water, 2 chairs, one of them still warm from the man who had just been sitting there. He sat down in his own chair, took Maeve's drawing from his jacket pocket, opened it. The man standing in sunlight beside the little girl and the woman, the bright yellow sun taking up half the page. Corvin looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart, and sat there alone in the dark room until the hum of the ceiling light was the only sound left. At 11 o'clock that same night, the night Tynan was cast out, Corvin sat across from Philip Varga in a private room on the 2nd floor of a seafood restaurant on Northern Avenue in the Seaport. Varga had chosen the place. Corvin had agreed. The location didn't matter. What mattered was who walked away with more. The room was small. 1 round table, 2 chairs, a bottle of red wine no one had opened. Varga had arrived first and was already seated, both hands resting on the table, the gold ring on his little finger catching the warm light. 2 of his men stood outside the door. 2 of Pierce's men stood opposite them. 4 men watched one another in the hallway like 4 guns pointed at each other, waiting for an order. Corvin walked in, sat down, and didn't touch the wine. Varga didn't either. The 2 men looked at each other in silence for 10 seconds. Varga spoke first, with the kind of politeness that kept a knife hidden underneath. My condolences about your father. Edmund was a man worthy of respect, at least before he decided to retire. Corvin didn't react. I hear you've been busy lately, Varga continued, turning the wine glass without drinking from it. Dorchester, a woman, a child. You're not the charitable type, Corvin, so there must be something very interesting there. Corvin let Varga speak. He waited. That was how he always did it. Let the other man talk long enough to reveal how much he knew and how much he didn't. And Varga had just revealed it. He knew about Emery and Maeve, knew Corvin was protecting them, but he didn't know exactly what Maeve had. He was guessing, and he had come here to confirm it. Corvin decided not to give him confirmation. He would give him something more frightening. I have full control over the access to my father's account, Corvin said, flat, unemphasized, as if he were talking about the weather. Varga didn't move, but his finger stopped turning the wine glass. 1/10 of a second, enough for Corvin to know he was listening. My father collected things for 30 years, Corvin said. Everything, everyone. He leaned forward, just enough to narrow the distance between them, but not enough to call it a threat. I know the names of the 3 judges in Suffolk County your organization pays every month. I know the account number in Grand Cayman that you opened in 2017 under the name of a shell company in Delaware. I know about the shipment through the Port of Providence last March, the one you declared as medical equipment. Varga sat still. His eyes, those 2 black stones set deep in their sockets, didn't blink. Corvin didn't know all of those details from Edmund's account. He knew them from Orla. For 30 years, Orla Keenan had managed Edmund's house. She had heard every phone call, seen every document, remembered every name. Not because she was a spy, because she was the only person Edmund never hid anything from. And those scattered fragments of information, once Corvin strung them together, were enough to create the impression that he was holding the entire gun, not just a few loose bullets. This is how we're going to do this, Corvin said. He leaned back against his chair, both hands on the table, his face unreadable. You don't touch the child. You don't touch the mother. You don't touch anyone within 3 blocks of them. If I hear, see, or smell even one sign that your men have gone near them, the FBI receives the entire file within 30 minutes. No warning, no second negotiation. 30 minutes. Silence. Varga looked at Corvin. He was calculating. Corvin could see it in his eyes, in the way his gaze shifted slightly left, in the way one finger tapped the table once. He was weighing it. On one side was the code, the account, the possibility of power. On the other side was Grand Cayman, Providence, 3 judges, and the FBI. He was calculating the odds that Corvin was bluffing, and he was reaching the conclusion that even if the odds of a bluff were high, the cost if it wasn't a bluff would be everything, not a part, everything. Federal prison, seized assets, a collapsed organization. Varga lifted the wine glass, took one sip, and set it down. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked at Corvin one last time. You're more like your father than you think, Corvin. I hope you don't end the way he did. Varga walked to the door. His men followed. The door closed. Corvin remained seated alone. He looked at the unopened bottle of wine, the 2 glasses, the empty room. Then he breathed out. Long and slow. The kind of breath a man releases after holding it for 30 minutes without realizing it. Outside the restaurant, Pierce waited at the car. Corvin got in, closed the door, and sat still. Is it done? Pierce asked. He's pulling back. Because he's afraid? No, because of math. One child isn't worth losing an empire. Pierce nodded. Drove away. Corvin looked out the window at the Boston night. The lights blurred through the drizzle, and realized his right hand hurt. He looked down. 4 bruises darkened his knuckles, where he had clenched his fist under the table throughout the entire meeting where Varga couldn't see it. He had clenched it so hard, the blood vessels had broken under the skin. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Corvin drove to Marblehead. Alone. No Pierce, no driver. He parked at the end of the sloping road and sat in the car for 5 minutes before getting out. He was tired. Not tired from lack of sleep, though he hadn't slept. Tired because within 12 hours, he had cast out his brother and bluffed the most dangerous enemy in Boston, and both things could kill him in different ways. He walked up the sloping road. The house door opened before he could knock. Maeve stood in the doorway, her curls mussed from sleep, wearing pajamas covered in stars, hugging her stuffed bear. You came back. Her voice was simple, as if this were obvious, as if she had never doubted it. I told Mama. I told her you'd come back. Emery appeared behind Maeve. Her hair was tied up in a hurry, her sweater loose, her eyes showing that she hadn't slept either. She looked at Corvin, looked at the bruises on his hand, 4 dark purple marks across the knuckles of his right hand. She didn't ask where they had come from. She didn't ask what he had done last night. She didn't ask about Varga, didn't ask about Tynan, didn't ask about anything from the world of shadows he had just stepped out of. She only said, "Come inside, I'll make coffee." Corvin stood on the threshold. Early November sunlight slanted across the porch, laying a pale gold stripe on the wooden floor inside. Maeve had already run into the kitchen, her small footsteps moving across the floor, her voice telling her stuffed bear that the butterfly umbrella man was here. Emery stood inside, looking at him, waiting. And Corvin Aldrich, The man no one on the entire East Coast dared look directly in the eye, stepped across the threshold into the small house that smelled of coffee and sounded like a child. For the first time in his life, he stepped into the light. 1 month passed in Marblehead, and life began to take a shape Emery had never imagined possible. Not a perfect life, but a life where she didn't have to count every dollar on a bus at midnight. Corvin bought a small cafe on Marblehead's main street. The kind of corner cafe with a striped awning and wind chimes on the door, closed 6 months earlier because the former owner had retired. Legal, clean. Not $1 of it touched the world Corvin operated in Boston. He offered Emery the manager's position. She refused the first time. "I don't need anyone supporting me." The second time, Corvin said nothing more. He simply left the cafe keys on the kitchen table at the Marblehead house and walked away. Emery stared at those keys for 3 days. On the fourth day, she picked them up, walked to the cafe, opened the door, stood inside, breathing in the smell of old wood and coffee lingering in the walls, then called Corvin. "I'll take it. For Maeve. Not for you." "I know," Corvin said. The cafe reopened after 2 weeks of small repairs. Emery named it Oak, without explaining it to anyone, but Corvin understood. Oak Street, Dorchester, where an old man had grown tomatoes and a little girl had drawn suns. Emery worked from 7 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, enough time to pick Maeve up after school. She hired a young woman from town to help in the mornings. The customers were mostly locals, retired fishermen, mothers pushing strollers, boat painters stopping in for black coffee before their shifts. Emery remembered every name after the first week. She had always been good at that. Corvin visited every Saturday. He parked at the bottom of the sloping road, walked up, and knocked, even though the door was never locked. Every time he came, Maeve ran out onto the porch, like a ball of curls flying toward him. She made him sit and draw, made him listen while she told him about the seagull she had named Gerald because it perched on the fence every morning, made him try the cake Mama had baked even though Corvin didn't eat sweets. He ate it, every bite. Not because it was good, because Maeve stood beside him, looking at him with expectant eyes, and he discovered that he couldn't say no to this child. He couldn't. That unsettled him in a way no enemy ever had. Emery watched from a distance. She saw the way Corvin sat stiffly when Maeve leaned against his shoulder, the way he looked at the little girl drawing, with the expression of a man watching something he didn't understand but knew was precious, the way his hand steadied Maeve's back when she climbed onto a tall chair without a second thought, a natural reflex, instinctive protection, something no one had taught him but that lived in him anyway. And she saw the way he took the crooked little drawing from his jacket pocket every time Maeve asked, "Do you still have my picture?" Unfolding it for her to see, wrinkled now, the crayon faded, but still there, close to his heart, always. One Saturday afternoon near the end of the month, Maeve was drawing on the living room floor. Corvin sat on the sofa reading news on his phone. Emery was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The air inside the house was warm and quiet, with the soft smell of fried onions drifting from the stove, the scratch of crayon across paper, and the distant sound of waves beyond the window. So ordinary it almost hurt, because everyone in that room knew it wasn't entirely ordinary. Maeve stopped drawing. She looked up at Corvin, looked at him for a long time, said nothing. Corvin realized she was watching him and lowered his phone. "What is it, little one?" "You're like Mr. Edmund." Corvin went still. "How?" Mr. Edmund was sad a lot too, but he didn't say it. He looked far away a lot too. He sat alone a lot too, even when people were beside him. Silence. Maeve set her crayon down. She turned and sat facing Corvin, her legs crossed, both hands resting on her lap, serious in a way only Maeve could be serious, completely, without holding back, without pretending. "Mr. Edmund told me to keep a secret. He said to wait for the right person." Corvin didn't move, didn't breathe faster, didn't lean forward. He only sat there and listened, because he knew this moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to Maeve, and he wouldn't take it from her with impatience. "I think you're the right person," Maeve said. "Why?" "Because you keep my drawings." The little girl looked down at her hands, then looked up again. "Mr. Edmund kept them too. No matter how many pictures I drew for him, he kept them all, taped them to the wall, clipped them to the refrigerator. Someone who keeps my drawings is a good person." Emery stood in the kitchen doorway, a wooden spoon in her hand, motionless. She heard every word. Maeve took a small breath. Then she said the 6 digits. Slowly, clearly, one number at a time, as if reciting something in front of her class. Her voice was small but steady, each digit falling into the silent room like a pebble dropped onto still water. 6 digits. The secret the old man who grew tomatoes had whispered into her ear on the porch at the end of Oak Street. The secret the entire East Coast underworld was willing to burn everything down to possess. The secret a 7-year-old child had kept for months simply because she had promised. Corvin listened. He didn't take out paper, didn't take out his phone, didn't write it down. The 6 digits carved themselves into his mind in the clear voice of a child, and he knew he would remember them until he died. "Thank you," he said. That was all. Maeve nodded, solemn, and then her face brightened again, as if she had just set down something heavy, something she had been carrying longer than any 7-year-old child should ever have to carry. "Now I can keep drawing," she said, and picked up her crayon. Corvin drove back to Boston that night. The 6 digits sat in his mind, as clear as Maeve's voice still echoing in the living room that smelled of fried onions and sea waves. He didn't stop at the penthouse. He drove straight to the office, on the highest floor of the Federal Street building, the room where, 8 years earlier, his father had sat at the head of the table for the last time and said, "I'm leaving." 11 o'clock at night, the building was empty. Pierce was downstairs, standing guard, asking nothing. Corvin closed the office door, sat at the desk, opened his laptop, and for the first time accessed the system his father had spent 3 decades building. The interface was simple. One code entry box. 6 characters. Corvin typed each number, slowly, one by one. Maeve's voice read them in his head with every touch of his finger against the keys. He pressed enter. The screen changed. And the world Edmund Aldrich had kept hidden for 8 years opened before his son's eyes. Hundreds of files. Organized by year, by name, by organization. 30 years of records kept with such meticulous precision that Corvin understood at once why his father had been a man no one dared betray while he was still in power. Because Edmund didn't only know the secrets of his enemies. He knew everyone's secrets. Which official had taken envelopes, starting in what year, how much, through what channel. Which police officers were on hidden payrolls. Which precincts, who managed them. Which real estate transactions laundered money through which shell companies, in Delaware, in Nevada, offshore, Cayman, Zurich, Singapore accounts. Transport lines, which routes, which ports, who was responsible. Enough evidence to send dozens of people to federal prison. And not just the Aldrich organization. Varga was there. 2 other organizations in New York and Philadelphia were there. Even names Corvin had never heard, connections he hadn't known existed. Edmund had collected it all like a patient curator, each piece of information a brick, and when they were stacked together, they formed a wall no one dared climb. Corvin opened folder after folder, read, registered. He wrote nothing down. Everything stayed in his head. It took him 2 hours to review most of the structure. Then he saw it, a separate folder, outside the classification system, with no organization name, no year, only 2 words. For Corvin. He opened it. Inside was a single text file, not encrypted, not protected, just a letter. Edmund had typed it, but Corvin read it and heard his father's voice in every sentence, that low, slow voice he used when saying something important, never raised, never rushed. "My son, if you're reading this letter, it means you've found the code. And if you found it the way I hoped you would, it means a little girl told you willingly. Not because you forced her, not because you threatened her, not because you bought her, but because she trusted you. That was the final test I left for you, Corvin. Not the code, the way you obtained it. I could have written those 6 digits into my will. I could have told you before I left. I could have given them to Orla, to a lawyer, to anyone. But I chose to give them to Maeve, a 7-year-old child who knows nothing about our world. Because I knew the only way you could get the code from her was to become someone she trusted. And for her to trust you, you had to be patient. You had to be present. You had to protect without demanding anything in return. You had to become a human being, not the machine I unknowingly taught you to become. If you've read this far, it means you did it. I'm proud of you. I was always proud, though I never knew how to say it when I was still sitting across from you. I left because I didn't want you to watch me die slowly and think that was weakness. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I should have stayed. Perhaps I should have told you more. I'm sorry for the things I never said. Use what is in this account to protect, Corvin. Don't use it to destroy. There's enough destruction in this world already. And take care of the little girl, Maeve. She is the small sun I didn't deserve to be warmed by, but I was. In the last 8 years of my life, I had nothing but a rocking chair and a tomato garden, and a child who drew pictures for me every afternoon. Those were the happiest 8 years of my life. I love you. I should have said that more. Corvin finished reading. He sat still. Read it again. From the beginning. More slowly. Every word. He read it a third time. Then he closed the laptop. Slowly. Gently. Set it down on the desk. The office was dark, with only the streetlight beyond the glass casting a pale orange stripe across the ceiling, like the same stripe of light in the small apartment in Dorchester, where Emery had once sat against the refrigerator at 2 o'clock in the morning. Corvin sat in the dark room, alone, the way his father had sat alone for 8 years in the house at the end of Oak Street. And for the first time since the day Edmund Aldrich had walked out of this building and disappeared from his life, Corvin cried. Not loudly. His shoulders didn't shake. Tears simply ran down the face of the man the entire East Coast believed had none, flowing in the dark room, alone, as if 8 years of not crying had broken open all at once. And he no longer tried to hold it back because there was no one left to hold it back for. He sat there for a long time, until the tears stopped, until his breathing steadied, until he took Maeve's drawing from his jacket pocket, opened it, looked at the man standing in sunlight beside the little girl and the woman, then folded it again and placed it back into his inside pocket, close to his heart as always. Then he stood and drove toward Marblehead. Corvin arrived in Marblehead at 11 o'clock at night. He didn't call ahead. He had driven the 45 minutes from Boston in silence. No radio, no phone, only the sound of the engine and his father's letter echoing through his mind, sentence by sentence, word by word. When he parked at the end of the sloping road, the lights in the house were already off. Only the pale yellow porch light remained, spilling outward, and the shadow of someone sitting in the wooden chair on the porch, Emery. She sat there with her legs drawn up on the chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking out at the night sea. The waves broke softly against the rocks below, steady and slow, the breathing rhythm of something larger than all of them. She heard Corvin's footsteps on the gravel path and didn't turn around. She had grown used to the sound of those steps. Heavy, even, certain. The footsteps of a man who always knew where he was going, even when he didn't know where he would arrive. Maeve is asleep, Emery said when he stepped onto the porch. Corvin nodded. He didn't sit right away. He stood beside the railing, looking out at the sea, both hands resting on the wood, and stayed silent long enough for Emery to know he was trying to find a way to say something he had never said to anyone. My father left a letter, Corvin said. In the account, hidden behind hundreds of files of evidence and transactions, there was a letter written for me. Emery didn't ask what was in it. She waited. He said the code wasn't the test. How I obtained it was the test. Corvin turned back and sat in the chair beside Emery, close but not touching, a distance of a few inches that both of them were aware of. My father gave the code to Maeve because he knew the only way I could get it was to become someone she trusted, not forced, not bought, trusted. He wanted to see whether I was good enough to receive it the right way. Silence. The waves broke. The sea wind carried the cold scent of salt across the porch. Are you good enough? Emery asked. Her voice was soft, not judging, not mocking, only asking. I don't know, Corvin said. He looked down at his hands, the bruises still faint across the knuckles of his right hand. I've done things good men don't do. I live in a world good men don't live in. I don't know if I'm good enough. He lifted his eyes to her. But I'm trying. Emery looked at him, looked for a long time. She saw both men inside him, the man the entire East Coast feared, and the man who drew a cat that looked like a cockroach so a 7-year-old child could laugh. The man who had exiled his own brother with silence colder than a knife, and the man who kept a crooked little drawing close to his heart as if it was the most precious thing he owned. She saw the darkness and the light, and she didn't pretend the darkness wasn't there. But she didn't deny the light either. Edmund was right about you, she said quietly. Did he say something? He didn't say anything. but he gave the most precious thing he had to my daughter to keep. And he knew you would find your way to us. He knew you would protect Maeve. He trusted you." She looked out at the sea. "That's enough." Corvin looked at her. The woman he had first met through Pierce's report. 2 dry lines of text. Name, age, address, 2 jobs, 4 hours of sleep. Now she was sitting beside him on a porch facing the Atlantic, and he knew he couldn't promise her anything normal. He couldn't promise her a life without danger. He couldn't promise tomorrow would be peaceful. He couldn't promise that the world he lived in wouldn't someday come knocking again. "I can't give you a normal life," he said. Emery turned to look at him. And for the first time, she smiled. Not the polite smile from Callahan's, not the forced smile she wore for Maeve. A real smile, tired, gentle, beautiful in the way of things that had suffered and still remained whole. "I've never had a normal life," she said. "I slept 4 hours a day for 3 years. I counted tip money on a bus at midnight. I ate leftovers from the pot while standing in the kitchen because I was afraid that if I sat down, I wouldn't be able to get back up. Normal has never belonged to me." She looked straight into his eyes. "I don't need a normal life. I just need a real one." Corvin said nothing. He didn't need to. The 2 of them sat on the small porch in Marblehead, looking out at the night sea, listening to the waves, and the few inches between their chairs narrowed when Emery placed her hand over his, lightly, not gripping, only resting there. And Corvin, the man whose hand had signed orders no one dared question, didn't move. He let her hand stay there, warm, real. 6 months later, Maeve Shaw was 8 years old. She was running on the Marblehead beach, barefoot on the wet sand, her brown curls flying in the May wind, her mouth open in a smile so wide it seemed almost to swallow the horizon. She ran fast, truly fast, both arms spread wide like wings, and Gerald the seagull flew above her as if he were racing her. Emery stood on the porch of Oak Cafe, her apron tied at her waist, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching her daughter run. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. For the first time in years, she was sleeping enough. For the first time in years, she wasn't counting tip money on a bus at midnight. For the first time in years, she smiled without having to try. Corvin arrived in the afternoon. His car stopped at the end of the sloping road. He walked up, still in dark clothes, still with that steady, quiet stride. But something was different. His shoulders were less heavy. His eyes were less cold. Not much. Just enough for Emery to notice. Maeve saw him from the beach and ran up the hill, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, her feet covered in sand. She crashed straight into him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and Corvin lifted her without slowing a step, as if this was something he had done all his life, though in truth, he had only learned it a few months ago. "I drew you a new picture," Maeve said, still hugging his neck. "It has you, me, Mama, Gerald, and even Oak Cafe. I'll show you later." Corvin nodded. He set Maeve down, and she ran into the house to get the drawing. Emery stepped closer. She stood in front of him and straightened his collar, a small, natural, familiar gesture, the kind that only belongs to people who have already passed beyond being strangers. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. Neither needed to. In the inside pocket of Corvin's jacket, close to his heart, the drawing Maeve had made months earlier was still there, wrinkled now. The crayon faded. The folds softened from being opened and folded again so many times. But he still kept it. The man standing in sunlight. Still there. Always there. And on the living room windowsill of the Marblehead house, beside a jar of wild daisies Maeve had picked near the beach, there was a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Edmund Aldrich, sitting in the creaking rocking chair on the porch at the end of Oak Street, Maeve on his lap, both of them laughing. Behind them was the tomato trellis. Emery had taken the picture on her old phone one afternoon when she hadn't known it would become important. But it had become the most important photograph in this house. The old man at the end of the lane, his little son, and the son who had finally found his way out of the darkness, not because someone dragged him out, but because a 7-year-old child handed him an umbrella covered in butterfly stickers under the rain and told him he should stand where there was sunlight. Sometimes, the smallest kindness comes from those who have the least. And sometimes what saves the people who seem impossible to save is a crayon drawing, a paper flower, and a little girl who believes that anyone who keeps her pictures must be good. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this story touched even one small corner of your heart, please press the like button and share this video with someone you love, especially someone who needs a reminder that kindness always has power, no matter how harsh life becomes. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss meaningful stories every day. We'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Who did this story make you think of in your real life? What moment did it bring back? What person showed you kindness when you least expected it? Please write it in the comments below. We read every comment, and every time we read one, we can feel your hearts inside it. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you very much. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.